Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm speaking with Félicie Krikler from Barr Gazeta's Architects. We're talking about co-housing, space standards, the importance of good design, making the best use of existing buildings, and this excellent document called Good Homes for All, which was put together by Architects Action for Affordable Housing and the Architects Journal. So it's all good stuff, and I'll see you on the inside. Right, just a quick one. Whether you are a massively experienced and well-established property developer already, or maybe you're a new or aspiring one, either way, you will know that it is really not easy to find viable opportunities to come up with the best scheme, the best design that's going to maximise the land value and fully de-risk things for you, and then to go on to get the very best planning permissions as quickly as possible. But however experienced you are, you will know that that is not an easy thing. I have put together a super detailed scorecard based on my 40 years experience in this industry, reverse engineering everything that I've learned, including lots and lots of mistakes over the years, and everything I've done to maintain, touch wood, 100% planning track record. I'm pretty sure there will be stuff that you don't know. Go and do that scorecard. Find out just how good or not your current process is, and I absolutely guarantee you will learn at least a little something, if not a ton. So it's bit.ly/MLA score, all in capitals. You can do the Millbank Land Academy scorecard. I absolutely guarantee you will find some interesting stuff, and it will help you get much better deals. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Okay, so what I usually do here is just ask you to do a little intro. Tell us how you got started in architecture, what you do, what you're up to. Little CV.
Okay, short CV. So I'm Félicie. I'm French. I studied architecture in France. And I did a year Erasmus exchange, came to study in the UK. It was meant to be just for 1 year in 1996. And I stayed after that. I really enjoyed working, in particular in London. So I've got dual sort of registration with France and the UK as well. I was always really interested in housing, mainly because of the importance of housing on people's lives and how it's something so intimate and really important to everyone's future. And so I started working at Sale Architecture in 2000.
Sale?
Yes.
Oh, that's where you started?
Yes.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Well, I'd had a few sort of, jobs in smaller practices here and there, but there was something that I was really interested in, which was, housing at scale, I think. And Sale, it was a fantastic place to work. I started there as a newly qualified architect in 2000. And I only left very recently at the end of last year, December 24, after 24 years. And I had been a director there for about nearly 10 years. So that's really where I built most of my career, Decided I wanted to do something slightly different, I suppose. And I joined a practice called Barr Gazeta, which is not so much known in the world of housing. And a lot of people say, who are they? It's a foreign name. We've never heard of them. I suppose they're better known for the work that they've been doing for the last 30 years in workplace design. A lot of their projects are cut and carve, a lot of retrofits. There's really good experience with a lot of the architects in how you can, how to reuse existing buildings. And I suppose, the sort of leaving a Sale and starting somewhere different was this sort of idea that I almost wanted a new challenge. I probably want to work for another 15 years. And although, I loved my Sale family, it was also a really good opportunity to start to do something new and to start working with different people, work in slightly different ways. And yeah, because I think a bit of change is something that sort of keeps you young.
Yeah, very good. Well, that we all need a change now and then, don't we?
Yes.
So for people that don't know, Asao, I really like Asao. They're probably one of my favourite, what I call a proper developer's architect. They come up with really good stuff, and they get it. Your new firm, not got such a reputation for housing, but is that what you're going to be doing?
So
is it?
I've joined them specifically. I'm board director, but head of residential as well, because they have done, historically quite a lot of residential designs and developments. It's just that it's been sort of almost like in a haphazard way. So sometimes for existing clients, they were working with more on the commercial side, sometimes just for residential developers, but sort of I've joined to sort of give this a bit of direction and I suppose a bit of cohesion. But yeah, I'm really interested in the real knowledge of all the architects in how to work with existing buildings, because I do think that we're in a time where the sort of buildings, should be considered in quite a flexible sort of way. And we're talking a lot about retrofit, for example, at the moment, and how that can be done well and effectively. I do think as well, when we're designing new buildings, we probably should be thinking about these buildings for future retrofits, and how do you make them? How can the systems, how can the services, how can the access, for example, work really well, so that in 30 years' time we want to suddenly change the use? That might be a possibility. It's interesting because in France, I think it's in Bordeaux, there is a building which has got consent for multiple uses, and it's something that I think is, and I'm not entirely sure as I'm not working in France, but it's a new use class which is more for a more versatile use classes. So you have to demonstrate how you are designing these services, access, and how they can work for both for office, residential and leisure, and then buildings can change over time depending on changing market forces, because I suppose that's what we're dealing with. And when I was at a sale, I did interesting sort of research piece with my colleague then, Rory O'Hagan, who we were looking at, it was for a competition for Meridian Water, actually, looking at a construction system that could be accommodating a number of different uses, which I think is something that we need to be thinking about a lot more, and we were thinking back, for example, what makes a building that can be reused. For example, if you look at the Victorian warehouses, they used to be warehouses, then they became storage quite often, they became offices, then they became loft apartments, and it's actually, they've got really good structures, they've got quite big spans, they've got large windows, and all of that means that the bones are really good, so actually you can do quite a lot of different things inside them.
I was a little bit anti-conversion personally. One, because I as a developer started off doing that stuff when I first started out, and actually then I sort of started doing new build stuff, and new build from a building point of view, as a developer's point of view, is way easier. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons I sort of stuck with that personally. And then in 2012, and well, you all remember this, for years and years, and this whole thing is meant to be quite educational, right? So some people don't know this, what I'm just about to say. For years and years and years, getting permission to convert an office to residential was really difficult, because even though the office might have been sitting there empty for years, most local authorities had a real super hardcore loss of employment policy, and they'd say, no, you can't convert it, we need it for employment. Yeah, but it's been sitting here empty for 10 years, and there's tons of office space on the market and the rest of it. So I think largely as a result of that, the whole Class O office to resi conversion thing came in, and a whole load of people that weren't really developers. I think it attracted a lot of the wrong people into the sector, and a real load of diabolical shite got developed, to be honest.
And lots of rubbish homes.
Really bad.
We've seen all of them, the no window homes, the non-openable window tiny studio flats that are, just on the motorway. Yes, and I think, PD, permitted development, has been quite the problem, really, in sort of encouraging this type. I think I'm hoping that it's something that is of the past, because, there are sort of changes in how homes have to be created, and certain criteria that needs to be met to be able to create homes in terms of sunlight and daylight, external space, and all sorts of things. So no, I know it's been done, and people have been squeezed into buildings that were just office blocks, still with sort of windowsills up to there. It's a shame. I suppose I'm thinking about, how we reuse. Maybe it's more, there are so many degrees and variations of how you can reuse an existing building. And in a way, so I've been working on a study recently on, looking at a number of different uses, either in the existing office building or in a new building. And actually the sort of solution that we have found, which is sort of most cost effective, but also most effective in terms of embodied, is to keep the basement and the retaining walls, which is already existing. So we're not touching that. We're removing the building, but in a way the building is the tip of the iceberg. So we're keeping that basement, keeping the substructure, and then working from that. So I think there are, there's that's an extreme, I suppose, where the existing building's gone, but there's still traces of it in the ground, and that remains, to then just keeping the structure, removing the facade. We've been working on a Holbein Gardens, a scheme for Grosvenor, and I don't want to name the wrong client, I'm pretty sure it's Grosvenor, which is an office building. So retaining the facade because it was office to office, but then extending the building, reusing existing steel from some of their other sites. So it's been about moving materials in a way to not create new materials, but just working with as much existing things as possible. So and the varying degrees are, do you keep the facade? Do you remove the facade? How much, for example, if you're removing the facade and, for example, you're turning an existing office building into residential and you want to create balconies, how do you create these balconies? Sometimes you might have to almost like re-add a whole sort of ring of steel around each floor that you can hang your balconies on. It's the sort of balance between, I suppose, cost effectiveness, embodied carbon, and then planning gain as well. For example, if you've got quite a large, office building, which is existing, that exists as a structure. If you were starting from scratch, demolishing it, starting from scratch, rebuilding a new building, it might be that you have actually a low building. So it's quite complex.
It's very complex. I've got to say, I can definitely see the sense in stripping office buildings back to the frame. You didn't do the one in Chiswick, did you?
A cell.
Right, yeah, okay. Well, the old Shepherd's Bush offices. Are we talking about the same one?
Chiswick
right on Chiswick Green.
Yes.
Turnham Green is actually green. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so it's interesting. So I think they did exactly the right thing. I'm sure it was super duper costed accurately. Pretty tall. Can't remember how high it was, but stripped it right back to the frame. The worst type of conversions, the ones that there were a lot of when the whole Office to Resi thing first came out, where people are just like, they're just trying to do it as cheap as they can.
Yes.
And you end up with a real load of horrible stuff. Now, obviously, it's got to be viable, and we've got to get deals to stack up, but it's where you draw the line, really.
Also, I think what's quite interesting is that, obviously, what type of housing are we talking about?
Yeah.
Because, you have developers like Hub, for example, that have, got great schemes that they've got planning consent for in the city, for example, and they're specifically for co-living. So co-livings are slightly there's studios, they're between 18 to 28 square meters. So the grid is different. The amenity space is provided in a different way. So it's more about shared amenity space internally and externally. And yes, I think there's a whole range of sort of different, they call what the alternative residential uses. That might work better than sort of straightforward sort of housing that we might be thinking of.
I think the point is really, obviously, every site, every situation is different. The name of the game always, it is about viability. You've got to get the deal to stack up. If that means converting the building, then obviously that's what you need to do. Yes. If it means knocking it down, then that's probably what you need to do, Yeah. And very often, actually, more and more, I think a lot of places it ends up being a bit of both.
Absolutely.
You got anything interesting going on at the moment?
Well, I've just been talking about studies to try and assess existing buildings. I suppose I'm always, in terms of other things that I've been doing, so I've been part of a group called Architects Action for Affordable Housing. You know how architects always like to get together, and which is a really good thing, and collaborate, because we're putting a few heads together and sharing experiences is actually really good. So that was a group that was started probably about 18 months ago, which is been led by Luke Tozer from Pittman Tozer. So it's been Pittman Tozer, Michael Riches, May, Grounded, HTA, and Bell Phillips as well. So we've been, we were sort of getting together ahead of the general election, thinking that a new government was likely to be in place, and we wanted to be ready and just talk about priorities for building good affordable housing. And I will show you this, which is a document that so it's Good Homes for All, and I suppose it's probably the culmination in a way of what we've been talking about for the last 18 months. So this is publication that was done jointly with the Architects Journal. It's 20 examples of good and varied housing, giving all sorts of metrics in terms of price per square metre, sustainability credentials. It's got the sort of the client's voice, the architect's voice, and the resident's voice as well. They've all been lived in, and it's just about, how we were trying to create this really to talk to government. And so we had to launch it at the House of Parliament maybe a month ago to try and talk to MPs and locally elected people, because quite often when we're talking about the 1.5 million homes, the numbers are huge. We all know that quality is really important if we want these homes to be good now and also in the for future generations. It's a long-term game. So, and if you're in government, you need to see examples as well, because on the idea of what makes a good home, it's just an illustration, really, to be speaking to government. So that's a document that I would recommend.
So reading. Just want to get, where is that available?
So this is available online on the Architects Journal website. And it's called Good Homes for All, 20 examples of how to do housing. They're all different examples they're across the country. They're not just London. It's very important to look at the country as a whole. They're also quite varied in terms of, are they, for late living, who was the client? Was it Community Land Trust? Was it a developer? An affordable housing provider? So there's quite a wide spectrum. And yes, so that's something that, I always have my little, I suppose I have my job, and that I really enjoy and take very seriously. But I think it's, as architects, we're often quite engaged and I do enjoy very much, talking and collaborating with others to try and think about how we do things, how we can do things better. So try and get involved in other enterprises.
The main reason for creating this whole podcast thing was really all about collaboration, because I think for far too long, property development, housing, getting stuff built, it is complicated, it is difficult. There's loads of different people involved, architects, developers, local people, residents, planners. And for a long time, I think, everyone's been in their own sort of little silos and they haven't seen it from other people's points of view or really got how it all works. And as a result, you get lots of, it's difficult enough anyway, without all of the misunderstanding and miscommunication. So, the more people get it and can start working together,
I
better.
agree. I was, it was UK Reef last week. And is there a better place to have an overview of, our ecosystem, our construction ecosystem? And it's really, really important, when I'm sort of talking to younger architects, it's like architecture is the, design and buildings is what we're creating, but we're part of this chain. You have the investors and funders, and they've got the money, and they've got a real interest in where they're investing their money. So, and then the whole chain in terms of developers. I tried, and a few months ago, I got one of our clients who's a development manager to come in and give a CPD on, why our schedule of area is important. Architects are, it's a really important part of what we produce. And it was trying to explain, to the practice, why is having a detailed and correct as well schedule of areas really, really important, and how is that then, sort of looked at and studied, and what are the most important things to do with it? Because it's, as you say, if we're just, looking at, what we're producing being, spread across a number of so many different parties, and seeing that spectrum from those that are going to be using real estate as an investor sort of vehicle, down to people who are going to be living in the homes that we have designed is really fundamental. A few years ago, I was, I suppose another side project. I was involved in. It was part of the RIBA research leads group. So Flora Samuel was the lead on that group, and we created. We were talking about social value a lot because we're all talking about social value, and I suppose in the architect's world, we're very often, like for procurement, we'll be asked to demonstrate how we create social value, and we all said, we're creating social value in terms of the project itself and the construction and how we're relating to the local area, and are we creating immediate sort of jobs, how are we involving the community, but quite often through procurement anyway, social value is looked at in relation to, that period of construction, and afterwards the homes are built, and you sort of lose that notion a little bit. And I suppose our premise was to say, well, actually we're creating social value through creating good quality homes. Because if you think, for example, just estate regeneration or infills, where you're going to be, creating really good homes for people, in a way you would want to measure the satisfaction and the improvement to the quality of their life. So we looked at it qualitatively, I suppose, in terms of creating surveys. That would be part of post-occupancy evaluation, but looking at, are people feeling a sense of autonomy? Do they feel safe? Can they let their children play in the streets? Do they have enough storage? So about the quality of life, and also quantitatively in terms of then savings that would be, sort of money savings in a way that are provided. So that was using proxies. And I'm not the best person to know about social value, I suppose. But that was a really interesting project because, you know, we were trying to explain that as architects, our projects don't end on the day of completion and then when people are moving in. Our responsibility lasts throughout the whole life of the building and is going to be impacting people's lives because that's where they're raising their children, where they're having, you know, it's their most sort of personal moments. So yes, that was another one of my interesting sort of little
it's massively important actually, and that's one of the reasons I talk quite a lot about good design and stuff, and one of my main focuses is on SME developers and trying to reinvigorate that sector. The whole social value thing is massively important, but I tell you what I seem to have noticed, you know, the public sector, local authorities and stuff like that, they sort of get it and talk about it and try to measure it and stuff like that. How do you find it with people? You know, because I know you typically work with much bigger developers, you work with all sorts of people, but I know you definitely work with lots of big developers. How into it or not do they tend to be?
I suppose it depends on the developers, but more and more there's a realization of the importance of social value. I mean, certainly and sometimes it's not called social value in a way. I mean, if you're working with, you know, for example, build-to-rent developers or long-term operators, there's a real understanding that, I mean, they're obviously going to be operating their buildings for possibly the next 40 years, that creating the community, first of all, designing buildings that are going to be conducive to creating a community and having, you know, creating a place where people want to stay, where they feel they belong, where they can make friends, where their children can make friends, and, you know, is really important. At a sale, you know, we're really good at being involved in the build-to-rent sector from its very beginning in the UK, sort of the early 2010s.
Yeah, I remember you were pretty much number one.
You know, credit to, you know, being there at the beginning and really being, you know, sort of continuing with it, and now having a huge portfolio of great projects that are lived in. And it's something that I've always been really interested in because there was that long-term view. And, you know, when some clients might have not been that keen to do post-occupancy evaluation, and to be fair, that's really what happens quite often, because if you ask, you know, oh, could we do this? We'd rather not go and ask people questions, because actually there'll only be bad things coming back. It doesn't always have to be like that. Historically, that's what I've heard, I suppose, quite a bit. But the build-to-rent and any managed, you know, whether it's build-to-rent, the later living, the co-living sector, the PBSA, there is that interest of, you know, people owning the buildings. Yes, they want these buildings to be successful. They want people to stay there. But that community aspect is really important. And I think it's great for architects to, you know, and it's also really good, for example, if you're, you know, I remember years ago working on development when, you know, it was all apartments and the ground floor commercial space. You know, we had to provide commercial active frontages, things like that. And the developer had sold the commercial units to a commercial agent. It ended up staying boarded up for like 3 years.
That used to happen a lot. Yeah.
You know, these white slatted.
Yeah.
And you think, well, people need to buy homes, so they will buy a home. But it's a real shame because there's nothing on the ground floor. And then the quality of what you're getting is, you know, there's no guarantee, basically. And there's no real connection between the two anymore. But it's true that with build to rent and more managed residential development, there's the connection between, first of all, it's, you know, you're doing a proper research in the local area to look at what exists already. And I don't like the word curated. I find it quite annoying. But you sort of do try and bring in, the right shops and the right enterprises that are going to be complementing the local area, because you're not just building your development in isolation. It's very much about the connection with the existing community, but also it's sometimes, bringing in. So I worked with Populo, for example. We provide a scheme in North Woolwich, and we were providing, I think, up to about 1,000 square meters of workspace studios on the ground floor. It's not giving the best rent, but actually it's being part of the local economy. It's also providing something, which is missing in the local area and has been highlighted as being missing. So there is a sort of a real interest. It's not just being sold off and
Sorry, and who did that one?
So that was Populo Living, who are the development arm of Newham. So their mandate is to use Newham-owned land, and then to really just create good homes. So good homes for local people. So the model, and I think varies sometimes, but the model was 50% affordable and 50% built to rent. But it's the type of built to rent which is, I think is the future in a way, because actually it caters for the biggest part of the population. So it's not providing a lot of amenity space, it's just providing very few spaces that are highly flexible. But the main mandate is to design really good homes that give people renting these flats security of tenancy, security as well of maintenance and management. And so that was in North Woolwich, and Popular have got quite a lot of sites that have already been built and in operation around Newham.
And you said something like it's the type of housing most needed. What's that? Smaller units, is it?
It's cheaper. It's homes, that are going to be affordable, not affordable as we sort of understand the term, but mass market affordable homes for people. If you look at, say, in the build to rent, I think we've been talking a lot over the last 15 years about, amenities and sort of the amenities race, in a way, that you have competition between schemes. And there are some. I went to see a friend the other day in Nine Elms. It's beautiful, the building she lives in. There's there are 2 swimming pools actually. Great amenity spaces, but it's going to be attainable by such a small percentage of the population. And if you think, most people only have a certain limited budget, they can't afford to rent these homes. They just need good homes that are going to be, homes are designed to space standards anyway.
That's why I asked. I assume smaller units, because stuff is so unaffordable for people that they're getting squeezed into smaller and smaller space, aren't they?
It's one of my the things that I've been thinking about for quite a long time, and I don't want it to be it could be a controversial topic, I suppose, which is space standards. Yeah. And
go on, this will be interesting, because I've got some thoughts on that as well.
Well,
that might be controversial.
So my thoughts are, I'm French, in Paris, you kind of buy the way flats are priced is by the square meter. You have to calculate your floor area based on a very sort of strict regulation. And then each area has got a bracket of between that much to that many euros per square meter. And then depending on the location, the orientation, and various things, it can vary. But I go to the supermarket, I might look at the price per kilo of something. It's something small and really insignificant, but yet I will be comparing 2 or 3 things based on their price per kilo. And yet we then go and buy like the most expensive thing we're going to buy ever. And then suddenly you don't necessarily know exactly what the floor area is. There's no real correlation between the floor area and the price. So it's a 1-bed or a 2-bed or a 3-bed.
Well, do you know what? It's really interesting you say that, because obviously from a developer's point of view, I know in order to, at the end of the day, you know, I've got to maximise land values. I've got to get the deal to stack up while still retaining a reasonable profit margin, which means hopefully I won't go bust if and when the shit hits the fan, as it always does at some point. So, you know, I'm always analysing and thinking about pounds per square foot or per square metre sales or rental values. It's just what you have to do to optimise schemes from a development point of view. Lots of buyers, they actually also start doing that. You know, they do start analysing stuff, I think, now on the pounds per square. Not all of them, obviously. Not everyone thinks that way, but I do
think they're more people are more discerning.
I think so.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's, for example, you know, the prime example, I think, is like pocket living. Yeah. So their homes will be slightly smaller than space standards, but this is reflected in the price, and I think that's a good thing, because it's actually adding to the variety of the types of homes. I also, you know, there is this stigma in the UK, which is like, oh, we have the smallest space standards in the whole of Europe. And I did actually do a bit of a study a couple of years ago on looking at new build homes in flats in France and in Paris and outside of Paris. And, well, that's not true. You know, there's much more of a variety of flats. It's just that the price will be, you know, if it's 40 square meters, you know, for a 1-bed, which can work in 40 square meters, you will be paying, you know, the 20% less than if it was 50, if my maths are correct. Well, but flats, you know, layouts have to work. It's all dependent on a lot of things, on the orientation, on the size of your windows. Is there access to external space? What is the floor to ceiling? You know, if you go for everything being minimal and being squished and being in the wrong location, then no, it's not going to work. But I do think, and I mean, I think partly, you know, the rise of co-living, I think is sort of responding in a way to a need for smaller homes that are going to be more affordable for people who can't afford to rent a 1-bed flat, but they're way past living in shared accommodation. As stuff gets increasingly unaffordable, people, I'm not saying it's right, but this is obviously what's driving it. It's a bit like HMOs. You know, the boom in HMOs over the last 20 years is because stuff's increasingly unaffordable. Likewise now, you know, with co-living, people want to buy or rent their own space, but they can't afford it. They end up getting squeezed into smaller space. So it's a whole another big conversation about affordability and the cost of living and stuff like that, which we're probably not going to solve. Just to touch on it very briefly, I think the co-living is really interesting because there are other, so if you're looking at, you know, renting in an HMO and how, you know, you're renting, about how you're sharing all your bills, about sometimes you're tied into your other flatmates and somebody's leaving and you're, you know, there's a sort of lack of flexibility, and there's also, yes, what spaces are you sharing? Whereas, you know, the co-living, when we look at the price, you know, it's all bills included. Yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. There's an ease as well for, you know, moving somewhere, and if you want to leave, you're not tied to finding another flatmate. So on a co-living scheme, for example, because I've never done one, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's a bit like build to rent. And I know a sale, for example, were absolutely, as far as I know, like the first, like, you know, Russell went to America and stuff when other people didn't even know it was a thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you were absolutely leading edge when you were there, cutting edge. But local authorities couldn't get their head around it for years and years. You know, it's a big sort of learning process for them to then start accepting it.
I think it's been the same with co-living. I don't know how many of them has everyone sort of got their head around it now? And two questions:
Not quite.
Have they got their head around it, and how are they with the space standards aspect of it?
Well, on the space standards, I think what really helped was, it was in 2024 at some point, but especially in London, there was guidance on shared living accommodation policy, H16, which was published, and which gave really a clarity about, the brackets of these sizes will be acceptable, no smaller, no bigger. This is the number of square meters you need to be provided as shared accommodation per studio, and then over 100, then it drops down a little bit. So I think in terms of the design, at least that really, really helped, because before it was quite difficult. I think, the fact that there are quite a few schemes that are built and operated is really good. I think what's really important is that the sector continues to see some very good examples of projects, because it's a product which is quite tempting, I think, for the viability side of things, and a lot of people are looking at it. And the last thing the sector needs is to have slightly substandard schemes coming on the market, because again, it's like with a PD, it gives a bad name to that particular type of residential. So, having good schemes, there are a number of operators who are, operating these schemes really well. And that's good. I think there's quite a number of, there are not, I suppose everyone who is involved in that is, leading on various sort of reports or sort of collaboration piece to really try and help the sector. I know, I think the BPF have got their own co-living committee. I'm on the ARL co-living committee. There's a number of, everyone who's in that sector really wants it to succeed, because it does palliate, for a particular need. I think it was a couple of years ago at MIPIM. I think it was the most interesting session I heard was on the special housing matters afternoon on a Monday. It was a Swiss sociologist who was talking about, changes in habits of how people live, and in a very sort of general and probably quite stereotypical way, she was describing that historically we had fairly linear lives where you grew up with your parents, you went to study, you were able to buy your own place, you started a family, and you just lived in that sort of linear life. That much more recently, over the last 20 years, actually people have, their lives are a lot more broken up, or they tend to vary quite a lot. So yes, you start in the same way, but you move out, you move back in with your parents, maybe you might move abroad, you might have a family, you might, you might have a divorce, differing circumstancing in your life. And I don't know how she measured it, but she said that a whole adult life, there might be a 10-year period where you're in between a few things. And when you're in between a few things, it's like, how do you vary? You don't need maybe to live in a big house, or you don't, but you don't want to be sharing with people again. And suddenly you need to sort of contract a little bit for a small period of time. It might be a year or 2 years, and then, and then you sort of change like that. So it's really, I think, also for that. I thought it was fascinating, and we often don't talk enough about, how we live and why these types of residential developments are really important, because we all have very different lives and very different circumstances, and I suppose that's why we're trying to accommodate is the variety.
Years ago we had the Parker Morris standards, where everything was big, really nicely sized. But of course, as things move on, like you say, demographics change, people's lifestyles change, but also, of course, as there is increasing pressure on viability and land use, stuff gets squeezed. So where all the balance is, and it's almost like, well, does one thing cause the other, or does one thing sort of create the other?
Yes.
I don't know. It's a big question, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I'll tell you, one of the things I do think is that very often, I mean, planning is changing so much now. I mean, everything's changing, isn't it? Councillors and planners, historically, it seemed to me have been, I suppose it's because, they've got policies. It takes a long time to get the policy put in place. Once they've got it in place, they just want to, look, planning decisions must be made in accordance with a development plan, right? So it's almost like they want to stick to it, and they don't want to look at any alternatives, including space standards. So, for example, we all know the office to resi conversion thing was a classic. A whole load of real horrible stuff got created as a result, which none of us want. But in terms of the nationally described space standards, which obviously are now policy, you can actually get good accommodation in less than those standards. Yeah, do you not think?
Yeah.
So for all exactly what we said, depends on the orientation. Big windows, lots of natural light, high ceilings, pocket living, as you mentioned as well, is a good example of that. So I don't really like to say too much about it, because I don't want to be looking like I'm a developer saying that everyone should be squeezed into small spaces. I'm not saying that at all. Yeah. But what I am saying, I suppose, is that I think those standards could be perhaps a bit more flexible.
Yes, I completely agree that there are sort of some non-negotiables in relation to space. But the thing that I find quite interesting is that the way space standards, in a way, have been used, and I think the nationally described space standards, the good thing about it is that it's sort of breaking down the home into the different areas, and that's where it becomes really interesting. But if you're looking at the sort of one bed, 51 square meters, and you end up with all your new one beds in the UK looking exactly the same, because they tend to be put in a position, they're single aspect, they have the door in the middle, and exactly, you can picture it. You come in on the left as your kitchen. From a developer's point of view, you've got to make it efficient. Absolutely. Everything ends up, it's going back to the point about variety, I suppose. How can we, I think we kind of need to be, I don't want to say designing more intelligently, because I think there's a lot of intelligent design that, goes on already. But I do think on the point of affordability, that it would be important to look at greater variety. I mean, the London plan stipulates, as a guidance, it should be nationally described space standards plus 10, which in London, especially in London, seems, I would ask the question that is it the right thing?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about it, this is a massive simplification, but, if you had nationally described space standards minus 10%, you could get 10% more homes overall. That is a massive simplification. But you could absolutely, good architects can get fantastic accommodation in 10% less than that space. So, and of course, what happens is, as we got less homes overall, people are, they still need to live somewhere. Yeah, look, it'd be fantastic if everyone could have a mansion with a swimming pool, but that's just not how it is. And when you've got this is what I think anyway, overly restrictive policies like nationally described standards plus 10%, you got people getting squeezed into HMOs. And interestingly, and I don't know how many people listening to this will know this, because I've got my foot in a couple of different camps, and believe it or not, I hang around in some hippie circles where most people out there might not know the amount of people in this country actually living in vans. Is massive, and they're not they're not all living there because they choose it. Yeah. It's because they are so skint,
Yeah.
and times are so hard for a lot of people that they are forced into crazy small space, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the issue with, you know, if you were saying, you know, you could reduce space standards, is then how is this bringing everything down towards the bottom?
I suppose the one thing, I suppose at least when you've got standards, it takes away the subjectivity, and you know, well, I've got to be X square meters, so I'll just be X square meters. Otherwise, the policy would have to say, well, I mean, it still can, you know, there are places where you could argue for smaller space, but then you have to go through a whole big, long explanation demonstrating that it's good design and that it still works well as well. And I suppose that all takes time and it's subjective. So
yes, which makes it
slows it all up and means you.
So maybe it's just
Yeah.
not the right alley to be going down. Basically, I feel that, yeah. But it's a really interesting topic, and I suppose with the new London plan being, you know, in at a sort of consultation period right now, you know, there are certain elements that have been mentioned in a way as how do you design good family homes in dense developments, for example. Now is the time to ask these questions. And I've been telling a lot of people I know, you know, who are architects in the housing world, is that it's really important to sort of have a good think about it and respond to the consultation.
If you could come up with just one policy or recommendation or something that you think would really help get more good quality housing created quickly.
So I've got one actually that I thought of, I've been thinking of for a while, which is to start looking back at, you know, how housing has been built in the past. You know, if you look at, for example, the Peabody developments of the sort of end of the 19th century, for example, you know, they were all built on the same principles. They were same height. They were set out. It wasn't even sort of considering the orientation. The detailing was quite simple and basic. They were arranged around green spaces. And if you look at London, you know, whether you had one in Pimlico or Islington or, you know, South London, they were the same or of a similar kind. Now, a lot of them are still there. They still have people living in them. Quite a lot of, you know, they've been upgraded. They were built on quite sort of harsh principles of how you had to live in them at the beginning. Obviously now, you know, they've evolved with the time. A lot of them are listed. But the interesting thing is that they were using simple principles and replicating them. So if I had one thing, you know, one policy that I could do is I would have almost like some pre-planning approved buildings, and whether they're, you know, smaller blocks, say 4 stories, whether they're smaller apartment blocks. I don't know how that would work because now we're really building on very constrained sites, and you know, we don't have the land that Peabody might have had to play with. It's constrained. But for example, if you look at individual, you know, houses, you know, developer houses, how about we have some really good pre-tested, you know, for performance, and then houses that can be replicated quickly either by SMEs or by larger manufacturers in a way, because there could be different types, and that could mean that SMEs could get into building them as well. And you get them pre-planning approved, and then maybe, you know, you have a system which is that for a site which is just houses and maybe lower rise apartments, you submit, say, an outline, and then your, you know, reserve matters. You can just use your particular house types, and so you don't have to. And I think it's this thing of reinventing the wheel every single time, when actually the things that really matter and where you can, it's like, how are you going to be laying out your roads, and how is your parking addressed? How much parking do you have? How are you developing in an area which is sustainable and not so reliant on cars, for example? These are like really important fundamental questions that need to be asked. But what I'm saying, I suppose, is that you could have good homes that are super performant and that can be replicated at scale. Why not?
I love it. I'll tell you something good as well. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it.
Are you?
Yeah. Not on the flats. not on the flats. I'm houses.
Okay.
I will talk to you about it separately, because I totally agree exactly that. Because one of the things is, so my thing's a lot about SME developers.
Yeah.
It's a bit like, I used to work for the big developers years ago, house builders, that. Of course, they've got their standard house types for a reason, right? They know exactly what they cost to build. They've got them detailed design. They don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. There's big cost savings there, yeah? For an SME developer, when, almost by definition, the sites we're looking at have to be bespoke, and you can't just go fitting rectangles in there. You've got to come up with funny angles or whatever to make the most of the land. It's much harder. But I do know from experience there are a few certain house types and sizes and configurations that work really well on a lot of sites. So I'm in the process of getting those designed up so that the other SME developers could effectively use those designs. And the beauty of that is obviously they work very well, and they can know exactly what they cost, which is a big part of the whole, thing we need to deal with.
Could they be pre-planning approved as well?
Well, that's the tricky one, isn't it? How you would do that, I don't know.
Me neither, but that would be really where you would be saving a lot of time.
Yeah.
Pretty much. If you could, just reduce that. Also reduce the risk and uncertainty. It's not just the time frame, it's that planning risk.
Lots of problems to be solved, but also lots of good stuff to be created. So
yes.
Very good. All right, well, look, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's great talking to you.
And I really love, so I've not seen that.
Yeah. Well, this is your copy.
Oh, lovely.
I'll give it to you.
Fantastic. I will really enjoy looking at this. Fantastic. All right, lovely. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together we can all help create better places, spaces and homes, and a much more beautiful world.